Welcome to Talk in the Park, conversations with Paul and Noel, where we gather to think out loud about what it means to follow Jesus in our world. I'm your host, Paul Pyle, pastor of discipleship at Patterson Park Church. I'm joined by my co-host, Noel Burke, one of the elders in our fellowship. Noel, tell us what we'll be talking about in this episode.
Today, we're going to look at one of your articles that you wrote back on September 11th of 2020, and it was called Mindset of the Disciple. And I wanted to just jump right in. There were a few statements that you made, two in particular that I wanted to read, and then I wanted to ask you a question. So the first one is, this is the mindset, the settled life posture of the disciple. I am a Christ follower. So I make it my life's aim to obey Jesus in every aspect of my life. There are no trespassing signs in my heart. Nothing about my life lies outside Christ's claim of lordship. So that's the first one. The second one is, anyone who self-identifies as a Christian who is not about that task is either walking in disobedience or is a Christian in name only, a cultural Christian, if you will. So you mentioned in the article that you kind of found a problem with that first statement. Can you walk us through what that looks like, what the issue is, and maybe a better way to state that?
Yeah, I've used that definition for years. Here's what I'm trying to get at. There are people who say, I'm a Christ follower, but they don't think about their relationship with Christ. They don't think about spiritual things. They don't think about Christ's claim on their lives, except if they're on church on Sunday. It just isn't really a part of their mental architecture. Their mental habits. And what I'm saying is, if you're a Christ follower, there is a center to your life, and that is knowing Jesus and loving Jesus and obeying Jesus, and everything else revolves around that. I heard somebody say it this way in a book that the women are reading right now in Bible study here in November as we're recording this. Following Jesus is not like adding a slice of religion pie to your already full plate. Following Jesus is the pie. It is the plate. There's a centrality and an all-consuming focus there if you're going to be a follower of Jesus. Now, you can call yourself a Christian and identify as a Christian, but that's a cultural Christian if you're not really serious about obeying Jesus.
So you're kind of poking at, the cultural Christianity where, and so that I don't offend, there are pockets of or areas in our country where it's understood that you're a Christian because you live there, and that's what everyone does.
Well, yeah, I'm not a Muslim, I'm not a Catholic, I'm not a Jew, and I live in America, so I must be a Christian.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. But then there's also that aspect of, have they really truly counted the cost?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And Jesus said there would be a cost.
Yeah.
He said, they abused me. They're going to kill me. What do you think they're going to do to you?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I could see with this, this definition, that my obedience to Christ is not a sliver of the pie. It is the pie. I could see how some might, hear that and say, oh, well, that just means that Christians can never go have fun. They have to stay home. They have to just read their Bible, pray, and only talk about Christian things, don't do anything else. What would you say to that person who takes that path of understanding?
Well, that sounds like a killjoy, and it doesn't sound like Jesus. When you read the Gospels, Jesus enjoyed being with people. He had a reputation for being at parties. Wine-bibber and sinner is how the old King James describes the Pharisees' criticism of Jesus. So clearly, he was somebody who enjoyed life, even though he had a very serious purpose, and he was very committed to that purpose, dying for our sins, carrying out the mission of his Father. And yet, he seemed to be the kind of person that people wanted to be with. So this stoic, driven person who has no time for nonsense, that's not the picture of Jesus we get in the Gospels. We have a Jesus who is clever. He has a sense of humor. He is a much more well-rounded person than that caricature would make him. And I want to be like that Jesus. I've always been mystified by that. How could Jesus the holy man Jesus, the sinless one who is always innocent, how could he be so interesting to sinners? They wanted to be with him. That's because he loved people, and he loved being with people.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up the parties and whatnot. He would certainly have a reputation for being at the wedding of Cana and all these other events, and with tax collectors and whatnot. And so he's at these parties, and he's not there because he's like, hey, great, let's have a great time. Let's just be silly and do things and not think much about it. He's there because he's trying to reach these people, and otherwise, that's where they are.
Yeah, but he's not buttonholing them and taking them into the corner to read the 4 spiritual laws to them either.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was very focused and very mission oriented, and yet very people oriented at the same time. He loved people.
Yeah.
And as an introvert, I'm amazed at that. My favorite moment in a party is when I step away.
Yeah.
And he just loved being with people.
Yeah. Well, and we have the Midwestern goodbye, so
yes, we do.
It takes a while. So you have that awkward sense for a long time, like, how about now? How about now?
You're reading my mail there.
Yeah. So, also in the article, you talk about this deception in our hearts. And then you ask this question, how can I know what actually does occupy the throne of my heart? Can you share how we could answer that?
Well, there are all kinds of, as I call in the article, usurpers to the throne of our heart that wants to be there, and we are more than willing to let those usurpers take the throne of our heart. I think the tell for us is our fears. Your fears greet you early in the morning. Your fears are kind of hovering around the edge of your consciousness, and when you have a spare moment, especially if you're of an anxious mindset, your mind will go back to those fears. And our fears really reveal to us our own hearts. If I am vain, my greatest fear is that I'll look ridiculous. If I have made an idol out of my career, my greatest fear is professional catastrophe. If I've made an idol out of my family, my greatest fear is that some Job-like catastrophe will fall on my family. And so there are lots of good things that can rightly occupy our attention, but they must not become idols. I love Tim Keller's definition of an idol. He said an idol is any good thing you start treating as the ultimate thing. And I think our fears will tell us when that's happening. And it's in the mercy of God that he, I said in another blog post, toppling our Dagons. He has a way of just crushing our idols. And it's a devastating experience when God crushes our idols. And yet that's what we need to go through in order to discover that our sufficiency is all in him.
Toppling our Dagons. I love that story.
We'll have to do another story, another podcast on that.
So, if I want to see if I can capture, what you're trying to communicate in this article, and then you can just correct me. So I'm going to do this live, but you are trying to dispel this laissez-faire Christianity, where you just say, hey, it's something I do on a Sunday morning, and then I kind of go about my own life. You are trying to help people count the cost. If you want to follow Jesus, it's not a Sunday affair.
Right.
It is a life decision that alters the whole trajectory of your life. And that doesn't mean that you can't go have fun.
Right.
It doesn't mean that you stop doing hobbies or other things. But it does mean that everything that you do is going to be seen through the lens of, does this honor the Lord? And when that happens, we start to see things in our heart that, my heart really desires this, but it really conflicts with the Lord. Is that kind of where you're trying to go with?
Right. And so you start thinking of all the arenas of your life, those private areas that most of the action is in between your ears and nobody else really knows about that except maybe a very close friend, those those other areas that are just a few of your friends, maybe your family knows about, and then the public area. In every sphere of your life, you say, all of this belongs to Jesus, and I want him to rule over all of it. So you spend really the rest of your life, the rest of your time on days on earth, as the Spirit slowly brings all of those things into alignment with his lordship so it's consistent. That's what holiness is. You begin setting apart more and more aspects of your life to his service.
Yeah.
And that's the sanctifying work of the Spirit.
Yeah, you're not telling God, hey, God, I need you to back off. This is my time.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And we don't want to say, and we're always tempted, we're always tempted to say, hey, he's Lord over everything else, but this one part of my life, I don't want him here.
Yeah.
I want the freedom to do what I want to do in that.
Yeah. And I think that, people could probably hear that and say, well, that goes back to the question of, okay, so don't have fun, don't just read your Bible, just pray, like only talk. And like, no, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about examining our hearts. And sometimes there's a guy that I discipled who loved to play golf.
Yeah.
And he would play on Sundays and everything. And I was trying to, share with him kind of this, hey, coming to the body on Sunday to worship together is important. And after he became a believer, he rarely plays anymore. It wasn't because I made him feel guilty. It was the Spirit saying, that's not really that important, is it? And him recognizing that. And he found other things that were far more important to him. It wasn't because someone twisted his arm or convinced him otherwise.
Well, let me give you an example that's parallel from my own life. When I grew up, when I was a little boy and the newspaper would come, I would look at the cartoons, the comics.
Yeah.
And then later as a teenager, I would first turn to the sports page. A little bit of a sports fan. And this is before Sports Talk was on the radio or ESPN or anything like that. And then I was kind of a sports fan, and then I had two experiences that really moderated my enthusiasm for sports. One was the 1975 World Series. I was in college in Missouri. It's the Reds versus the Red Sox. It was a 7-game series, and I remember when the Reds won, I was euphoric, and when they lost, I was despondent. And even as a teenager, I realized this is not good. Something I can't control has this much control over my emotions.
Yeah.
I dialed it back a little bit. And then I married a woman who wasn't a sports fan, and she's always been more interesting to me than sports. And so I don't watch sports anymore, much anymore. We'll watch maybe the Super Bowl or Ohio State, Michigan or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's about it. And sometimes, I'll check the scores and that sort of thing and listen to sports talk. But what I did is I found joys and pleasures that were greater than sports, and that made it easy for me to let go of that. But I also, I love the idea of there being an enthusiastic and passionate Christian who loves Jesus and also loves skydiving, and also loves Jesus and also loves quilting, or also loves collecting stamps. And I love the idea of Christians being sprinkled into all those communities, and being the light and salt and of the gospel and the presence of Christ in those places. So I don't want, and your friend can play golf. That's fine.
Absolutely. They can totally play that.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm glad he found a greater joy in being with the people of God, being with the family of God.
Yeah.
Rather than being off by himself.
Yeah, it was totally a work of God.
Yeah.
Doing that, and I'm glad that you brought all those things up, because I think my next question was kind of how do we start having that mindset, and it's not, well, what all do I have to cut out now, and it is taking an assessment though, right of what's really important.
Yeah, it is. And I mentioned those three spheres, what goes on in between my ears and that very intimate part, and then the private part that only the very people closest to me, and then the public part. And, all of that, everything, something from as private as my ambitions and as public as my work ethic. I want Jesus to be Lord of all of that, the whole sphere. Mm-hmm. And so, taking an inventory of what's going on in my life, how I handle my finances, how I treat my wife, how I interact with my neighbors. I want Jesus to be Lord of all that. So part of it is that inventory, that self-inventory, the introspection that says, okay, Jesus, what's going on in my life? And I want you to be part of that. But as I always say, in discipleship, you need to start from where you are, not from where you're supposed to be. Mm-hmm. So you don't want to you don't need to make lots of big life changes at the same time. Find an area where the Spirit is speaking to you about that, and then concentrate on that. And it's more about the posture of your heart than it is modifying your behavior. Ask God to change your heart, and then address your behavior. If you try to address your behavior without heart change, you're going to be frustrated all the time. So start from where you are, and if you're having trouble starting from where you are, pray from where you are. Pray that God can change your heart and give you healthy desires and healthier desires.
Yeah, our default position is to love unhealthy things.
Yeah.
So if you're sitting here thinking, I'm addicted to something that's unhealthy for me, you're in the same camp as the rest of us.
Right.
It's just that some people have put those to death more and have seen mastery over those. I love John Owen's book, The Mortification of Sin. I know that sounds like really deep, but he's really just talking about destroying the root or the seed of sin in our lives. Mm-hmm. And he talks about it from the standpoint of you will never eradicate all the weeds in your garden of life.
Lifelong fight.
You have to continue to pull them out over and over again. And if you get lazy and you stop doing that, the weeds get bigger and they're much harder to pull out.
Right.
If you are doing the constant things, it can be tiring where it's like, again and again and again. And yet that garden doesn't stop growing. And so it's important that we continue to do so. And so I think what you're saying is, that self-examination is kind of a ongoing process.
Right, and that can become morose, and then you can have all kinds of problems with false guilt.
Yeah.
So it really is opening up your heart to the Holy Spirit and saying, you draw my attention to what I need to see.
Yeah.
And don't start beating yourself up over every little thing, because false guilt is also not healthy.
Yeah.
And, sins and vices are easy to identify as things that ought to be dealt with, but also good things that are disproportionate, like your friend's golf. Mm-hmm. Nothing wrong with golf. Golf's a good thing. Walking out in nature, that's great, and that's fine. But any good thing can become disproportionate and then become a problem.
Yeah.
And then God has to deal with that as well.
Exactly.
Your love for your wife
can
even assume that kind of idolatrous proportion.
Yeah.
So it's all a matter of alignment. I love God first. I love others as myself, and especially my spouse, because Martin Luther said, that is the neighbor closest to me.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, because there could be some conflicts, right? What if you're in a situation where you're a believer as a husband and your wife, or I guess we'll just say your spouse is an unbeliever, mm-hmm. and they're saying, hey, the test of you loving me is sleeping in with me on Sunday so we can enjoy the morning together.
Right.
And it's like, okay, well, that's a good thing.
That's a worst case scenario. No.
It is a worst case scenario, but I'm trying to think of something like where, hey, I would really appreciate this, but then you're sacrificing your time with the body of Christ.
Right.
And you have to take that assessment.
Man, that it would be a thorny counseling question.
It would.
You just brought, and I don't even know how I would start to approach that question.
Take some time.
Way to go, Noel.
Yeah. Just throw a landmine or, a grenade in there and shut the door.
Right.
But hey, listener, I want you to understand that, there's not one perfect answer on this, and this is a lifelong pursuit. And if you're sitting there thinking, great, I want to do this, but I don't have anyone to talk to about this. Please don't do this alone. Find someone that you can confide in the church and walk together through this. And, sometimes that you were mentioning, Paul, what was the term that you used, where we kind of beat ourselves up unnecessarily. Like sometimes I think I could be passionate about something and I share that with one of the guys I'm discipling, they're like, why do you care about that? That doesn't matter at all. And it's like, oh, okay.
Yep.
I couldn't see that myself.
Yeah, that's one of the advantages of having spiritually mature people around you that you can talk to, because they can tell you when to freak out.
Yeah. Hit the panic button, or that's not an emergency.
Right. And on the other hand, you and I talking, and I realize there is a gross sin in your life, and you're lying to yourself about it. And I might have to say, Noel, this is a lot more serious than you realize it is.
Yeah, you need to take this seriously.
Right.
Yeah.
It works both ways.
Yeah. And I think, I hate to call this, find yourself an accountability partner. But at the same time, two strands are stronger than one.
And sometimes small groups, or the men's group, or maybe women's fellowship, there are places where you can have that kind of intimacy and openness with one another. Not all groups are willing to do that, but that's healthy if you can have a small group of people that you can be totally honest with and say, here's where I'm struggling. I remember there was a young couple who came here from a church in another state, and they said, we love that about our old church. So people would come to a small group and they'd say, yeah, we had a fight on the way tonight.
Yeah.
And just kind of, we need the gospel. We need the gospel in this moment.
Yeah.
So I like that when Christians can be that honest with one another.
Yeah.
Candid.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, that's good. Well, thank you for writing this article. I definitely, it was encouraging to me to think through that. It's that self-assessment that we all need to have regularly.
Well, it's just presenting ourselves to the Spirit and asking Him, primarily by His Word, but also by life circumstances, and also by the counsel of other godly Christians, to help us see our lives and how that works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Need that exposure. Okay, Noel, what are we talking about next time?
Well, next time we are actually going to record. So this was episode 26, which means that this is a full year.
Woohoo!
Yeah, we need to have some kind of ding-a-ding-a-ding-a-ding-a-ding.
Yeah, so John, when you're editing this, insert some sort of sound effect here.
Yeah. So, we'll have recorded one full year. I actually have no idea what we're going to do for the 27th, so I think we should probably pause this, and I should figure that out.
Talk in the Park is a production of Patterson Park Church. Noel Burke is the producer, audio engineering and editing by John Ambro. Music is composed, performed, and recorded by Jason McClurg. Check out the Discipleship Weekly blog at pattersonpark.org. Copyright Patterson Park Church. No reproduction is permitted. Join us next time for Talk in the Park, Conversations with Paul and Noel.